Why would a god bestow fire, something so vital, only for another god to punish us for having it? The story of Prometheus is more than rebellion. It's a mirror. Humanity learning to create tools, to fight cold, to eat cooked food, yet always tied to suffering. The Greeks didn't see this as a complete victory. They asked, what if every gift carries its shadow? And what if there's one thing still hidden? Something Prometheus never truly gave. Let's trace that question from flame to hope and discover what humanity's first gift really was. Imagine existence beginning, not with a cradle or lullaby, but with dirt pressed between the hands of a titan. No roof above you, no blanket wrapped around you, just mud shaped into fragile forms beneath the open sky. As Hesiod tells it, Prometheus molds men from clay and breathes life into them, torsos shaped piece by piece, limbs fitted together as if they might collapse back to nothing, eyelids waiting for something behind them to stir, rows of silent figures watching, while the gods glance down, amused or suspicious, at what their clever brother was doing in the soil. But clay by itself doesn't breathe. It doesn't laugh or cry. It just sits, cracking when the sun is harsh, dissolving when the rain sinks in. Picture a body without movement, skin made of earth, fragile enough to blow apart in the next storm. That's how Hesiod's image of the first humans appeared. Not strong, not divine, not chosen, just molded from the earth itself, suspended between form and ruin. So Prometheus leaned close and gave more. He offered breath, and that breath became life. Still, it was a thin gift. Not immortality, not wings, not lightning bolts in your hands. Instead, it was a pulse that could stop in an instant, air that could be smothered in smoke or drowned in water, flesh soft enough for claws to tear, a spirit hungry for food but with no tools to find it. Breath set you on your feet, but left you stammering forward into a world that promised nothing. Stand in that moment. You have no clothes for when the wind turns cold, no plow to cut the soil, no fire to edge back the night, just bare skin, a frail heartbeat, and a land that doesn't care whether you survive. It's more curse than blessing. Hesiod doesn't sing of humans as noble creatures crowned in glory. He draws them instead as needy, temporary, dependent. But, he adds, not beyond hope. There was always the suggestion that even weakness could be stretched beyond its limits. The world around them, though, was not softened by mercy. Thunder shook down from Olympus. Seas churned at Poseidon's moods. Forests hissed with wolves that didn't stop to admire what your skin was made from. Famine didn't back away because you starved. And if the gods themselves felt annoyance, they could scatter your kind like dust. Existence was borrowed time. Imagine those first people stumbling across hills and fields with nothing, digging bitter roots from the dirt and biting them raw, shivering together in the dark under caves, stomachs twisting, eyes wide at cracks of storm. Every day was a question mark. Would hunger end them? Would beasts hunt them down? Would the sky itself destroy them? Survivors, yes, but only in the thinnest sense of the word. And still, there was a turn. Fragility did not mean futility. Dirt may be ordinary, but shape can outlast material. Even fragile clay once fired can harden into something enduring. That's what sat inside Prometheus's breath, a pattern for survival. Not through strength, not through divine favor, but through resilience. Humans, though soft, carried persistence. They broke, but they could be shaped again. Hesiod's vision shows us this contradiction. Fragile, temporary, but carrying endurance. Helpless, but stubborn. This wasn't a race destined for easy extinction. It was one designed to struggle, adapt, and scrape forward no matter how little it had. Breath wasn't enough for safety, but it was enough for starting. The raw material was soft earth, but within it was an echo of something harder. That's why the clay matters. Clay untreated turns back to dust. Clay touched with fire becomes brick or pot or vessel. It can last centuries. That earth skin needed something, heat, to harden into lasting forms. Without it, the human race stood as temporary statues in a hostile world. With it, they could endure storms, time, and even the disfavor of Olympus itself. So imagine the scene one more time. A titan kneeling in wet ground, hands shaping fragile bodies. Those figures staggering upright under the watchful sky. No weapons, no shelter, no food but what bare hands might scrape. Their strength is not power, but refusal to collapse back into dust. A refusal to surrender that little thread of breath. Persistence, though, could only carry them part of the way. Tenacity doesn't warm the night. It doesn't keep wolves outside a cave or strike a spark against stone. To survive more than a season, humanity needed more. They needed something to strengthen their clay into permanence. Breath was the beginning. Fire would have to be the next step, and someone, at great risk, was willing to bring it. Why would a god steal fire? Something so small, so ordinary, knowing it would bring punishment. In Olympus, flame meant little. Thunderbolts streaked from Zeus's hands. Ambrosia never cooled. Eternal lamps burned without being fed. But to mortals below, fire was breath turned into permanence. It turned survival from fragile to possible. Prometheus understood this. That is why, instead of staging a raid or violent ambush, he chose cunning. He walked quietly to Olympus, waited by the eternal flame, and slipped away with a single spark hidden inside a hollow fennel stalk, a simple, ordinary plant. So the act read as cunning, not spectacle. The entire weight of humanity's future sat in that thin green tube. Zeus was not amused. To violate divine order this way was no small insult. Fire was not just a tool. It represented creation, transformation, the authority of gods to shape existence itself. Giving it to mortals was an unacceptable breach. Zeus, wary of any threat to his rule, feared that fire would give mortals a measure of independence from the gods, and that independence was precisely what he could not allow. The punishment was brief in its sentence, and endless in its execution. Prometheus was chained on a mountain in the Caucasus, exposed to sky and storm, where each day an eagle tore at his liver. Each night it grew back, and the torment began again. A solemn warning. Any god or mortal who tried to upend the balance of power would live as a cautionary tale. Yet from the ground where people lived and shivered, nothing could outweigh what that spark became. Small at first, the gift multiplied into tools, cooked food, and new social patterns. Fire carved a circle of light in the dark, a fragile barrier against predators that prowled just beyond the glow. It warmed the bones of clay-born humans who otherwise would have weakened and died through winter cold. It cooked meat and roots, transforming bitter and dangerous fibers into fuel for stronger bodies and quicker minds. From this one act of theft, survival began to stretch into something more than chance. Heat carried another power. It altered matter itself. Fire turned wood into charcoal, clay into pottery, sand into glass, or into metal. With flames, stone-tipped sticks became bronze-tipped spears, bones replaced with iron blades. Pots held grain through the lean months instead of rotting in heaps. Flames cleared fields for planting, and clay vessels stored the harvest. Those fragile first communities could now endure, carried forward on the strength of fire's transformations. Without it, people might have remained as soft clay, collapsing back into dust. With it, the clay hardened, resisting weather, beast, and hunger. Anthropologists centuries later would mark the hearth as one of humanity's great turning points. Charred bones and blackened circles of stone appear in sites hundreds of thousands of years old. Control of fire turned caves into shelters, dinners into gatherings, and gatherings into culture. Around fire, language flowed, songs were sung, and memory itself took hold. Prometheus did not just give mortals survival, he gave them community. He gave them the rhythm of life in circles of warmth and light. Civilization itself was born around flames. Zeus, however, looked past this warmth and saw defiance building. Fire meant that humans could endure without appealing to Olympus for every comfort. Each lit torch was a mark of independence, a reminder that mortals had no need to beg gods for daily survival. To him, that was rebellion dressed up as self-sufficiency. He knew too well that thrones overturned. He had cast down his own father. Giving mortals autonomy, however small, felt like the first flash of another succession. For Zeus, the fennel stalk was more dangerous than any Titan army, because it handed mortals a tool to rise inch by inch until even Olympus might feel vulnerable. And there was another image that must have troubled him. Humans with hammers at forges mirrored gods with storms in their hands. Mortal fire echoed divine lightning. Each furnace, each kiln, was a mortal imitation of godly creation. This reflected more than skill. It blurred the boundary between divine and human power. Every time a pot baked firm or bronze flared into shape, the echo of godhood rang out in the hands of mortals. Zeus could not miss the resemblance. Fire was not just fuel, it was identity. It taught humans they did not have to remain passive receivers of fate. They could change their world directly. To mortals, though, this spark seemed humble. Rub 2 stones, catch the ember, blow it into life. Nothing about a hearth fire looked spectacular compared to the storms raging above. But ordinary is deceptive. Again and again, survival hides in the plainest places. A cluster of human figures crouched around orange flames might not look impressive, but time proved otherwise. Empires came later. But first came fire. Not fury, not lightning, but a steady, patient glow that humans themselves could feed, nurture, and keep. This difference, the control, the quietness, was what made it so subversive. So why fire? Why endure chains and an eagle's talons for all eternity? Because Prometheus knew what it meant. He wasn't trying to arm mortals for conquest. He was giving them possibility itself. Once they held fire, they would not stop at warmth. They would build tools, pound metals, shape shelters, cook meals, gather together, and pass stories into the future. Fire was the first domino. Autonomy followed. Creativity followed. Everything that became human began here. The punishment Zeus imposed was meant to terrify others, to make obedience fold mortals back into clay. But the theft could not be undone. That single spark carried in a hollow stalk, multiplied into generations of survival. It outlasted Prometheus's agony, outlasted thunderbolts, and spread into every corner of human life. Zeus chained the Titan, but he could not chain what had already been handed down. And yet, there was a cost. Because in Greek stories, no divine gift ever arrives clean. Every blessing bends a shadow behind it. Fire reshaped what it meant to be human, but Zeus was not finished balancing the scales. Somewhere else, under the guise of another gift, another force began to move toward mortals. If someone gave you a jar, sealed tight, and told you never to open it, how long would you resist? Pandora did not arrive in the human world alone. She came as part of a larger plan. Prometheus had warned his brother Epimetheus not to accept gifts from Zeus, reminding him that the gods rarely gave anything without strings attached. But when Pandora was presented, radiant, adorned, and bearing a vessel unlike any other, Epimetheus accepted her anyway. That decision carried the weight of humanity's first great wound. What she held was called a pythos, a large earthen jar. In Hesiod's telling, this wasn't a small jewelry box or ornate chest, but a heavy storage vessel, the kind used for grain, wine, or even burials. Only much later did translators describe it as a box, a substitution that obscures what the Greeks themselves understood. The pythos was ordinary but weighty, woven into the routines of sustenance and survival. Placing every human misery inside it bound the fragility of life directly to that familiar container. Zeus's plan was precise. Fire had tipped the balance, giving mortals new endurance. The pythos restored the imbalance by loading that endurance with hardship. At first, it sat sealed, the contents hidden, its surface polished, its purpose unclear. It glowed not with promise, but with restraint, a closed silence at the center of mortal life. Yet Pandora, made with curiosity in her spirit, as much as beauty in her form, lived beside it. One day, the lid stirred. Whether from choice or accident, it opened, and what had been stored was no longer contained, not gold, not grain, not medicine or feast. Instead, the world gained sickness, toil, aging, grief. Along with them came jealousy, madness, and death. They did not file out in a measured line. They scattered and multiplied, attaching themselves to mortal life until they could no longer be separated from it. From that moment on, no human drew breath without breathing alongside loss or struggle. Pandora herself was not cruel. She was no villain, plotting to ruin the fragile beings Prometheus had shaped. But her creation carried a contradiction, designed with beauty to entice, and with a vessel that could never remain forever sealed. It was less a choice than a trap. Even her innocence fits Zeus's design, because the tragedy of the pythos lay in its inevitability. Humanity admired her, welcomed her, and with her came the jar. The moment of opening was certain. The only question was when. The story, familiar as it may sound today, has lived through layers of misinterpretation. When you picture a box, you imagine something like a treasure chest, portable, personal, small enough to rest on a shelf. But a pythos was large, rooted in daily life, connected to survival. Grain spoiled, wine soured, burial jars leaned heavy in the earth. The imagery was never about a trickster container or exotic gift wrapping. It was about something everyone in Greece knew by touch, the vessel that both sustained households and reminded them of death. For mortals, the release of evils reshaped existence overnight. Before, life was fragile but unburdened. Afterward, fragility found its companions. Work pressed on tired shoulders every season. Illness struck the body without warning. Time itself aged the skin and bones no fire could strengthen. Death waited for all, whether prepared or not. Fire still burned at their hearths, but now its glow flickered against shadows that could never be entirely dispelled. And here, the cruelty deepens. Zeus's generosity from the start was never simple kindness. He gave fire only to see it counterweighted with affliction. If mortals cooked food, famine would also come. If warmth kept them alive, cold winds and decay kept them near their limits. Advancement did not disappear, but each gain wore the price of fresh struggle. There was no escaping the balance. Mortals might build, invent, and endure, yet always with pain walking beside them. The pythos makes its point by scale. This wasn't a small gesture, a token punishment. It was the source of the defining tone of human life. Progress met with resistance, joy bound together with sorrow. In Hesiod's story, the gods made sure humanity could not mistake their place. Alone, mortals might have lived endlessly in the light of fire, drifting towards something like independence. With Pandora's jar, they were pulled back into dependence, into endurance shaped by pain. And yet, the story does not end in complete devastation. Some versions say that when the evils surged out into the world, Pandora scrambled to close the lid. Inside, one presence remained. Hope did not escape, still sealed in the jar. That one detail has troubled readers for centuries. If everything destructive left, why should only hope remain behind? Was it meant as kindness, so all the suffering might be faced with a measure of endurance? Or was it cruelty, trapping the one comfort that might have softened misery? Some thought Zeus left hope inside as a mercy. Others read the detail as another cruel trick. The ancient sources do not settle the question. The pythos, once opened, carried a silence as sharp as its noise. Maybe the gods allowed just enough consolation for mortals to keep going. Or maybe they withheld it to keep misery sharp. In this contradiction, the myth asks something more personal. Whether hope helps us endure, or whether it blinds us to suffering that will never leave. What cannot be denied is that the world changed. Fire and jar together defined the human condition. One gave humans the ability to extend their existence, to harden their clay into something more than temporary. The other ensured that everything gained would be tested by loss. Illness rose beside healing. Age haunted each success. Anger and rivalry split communities even as fire gathered them together in circles of warmth. Every use of the flame carried the weight of struggle introduced by the jar. Still, the fact that hope remained untouched matters. Even as famine wasted crops and storms ended lives, mortals still reached for something invisible, something that reassured them life was worth continuing. The jar never fully emptied. Whether mercy or mockery, its final contents meant humanity would carry more than misery. Which raises a sharper question. If Zeus intended to punish, why allow hope at all? If every affliction poured out into mortal life, why leave behind the one force that could keep them pressing forward? To open the jar was to unleash suffering, but to close it with hope still inside was to preserve something more complicated. This paradox stood at the center of the myth, puzzling even the ancient world. The balance of gifts and wounds set by gods shows its sharpest edge in that silence. Just inside clay walls, one last thing lingered, never released, never destroyed. It was neither wholly gift nor wholly punishment, but something between. And it is this question, the uncertain role of hope, that has kept the story alive as more than just a tale of divine tricks. It was, and remains, the unresolved tension at the heart of being human. Because after sickness, toil, and death spread across the earth, what lingered was not just pain, but an unanswered mystery. A sealed presence left behind, pointing to a dimension of life the gods themselves did not name. The next chapter of the story rests on that silence. Why Zeus would leave hope inside at all, and what that choice has meant for every generation since. Why would Zeus shut hope inside the same vessel that unleashed every misery onto mortals? In Hesiod's version, hope does not escape. All the plagues, griefs, and struggles fly out, but that one thing stays sealed. On the surface, it makes little sense. If punishment was the plan, let suffering spread and be done. Why leave something behind that mortals could sense but never freely hold? Was it oversight, intentional mercy, or the deepest cruelty? The ancient poet doesn't tell us, which is why the question still lingers. Picture the jar opening. Disease rushed out. Hunger stalked the fields. Jealousy slipped into homes. All of it spilling across the earth faster than any word could catch it. But hope stayed put. Was it too heavy to rise? Did Zeus tie it down, denying mortals access? If you had been one of those fragile early humans, staggering under waves of pain, you'd still feel the urge to push forward. Was that hope breaking through the seal in faint traces? Or was it trapped, unreachable, leaving only the tug of longing behind? Some people in antiquity leaned toward seeing hope as mercy, the single thread that kept mortals from collapsing under grief. Even in famine, you hold seeds because you think they might grow. Even in winter, you feed the fire because you think morning will come. Hope justified endurance when nothing else did. On this side, hope looks like the hidden cornerstone of survival. Others thought its trap ran deeper. Left inside, hope dangled like bait, ever present but incomplete. You keep working, waiting, striving for relief that may never arrive. Pain multiplied endlessly, not because mortals embraced it, but because they clung to that promise. In this reading, Zeus made endurance itself the punishment. Humans dragging forward through misery, unable to surrender because of a hunger that never ends. Scholars later debate whether the Greek word translated as hope, elpis, even means comfort in the way we imagine. Sometimes it shades closer to expectation, which can be dangerous. Expectation ties you to what might never come, keeping you bound to suffering rather than freed from it. Depending on how you read the word, the presence in the jar changes. Either fragile comfort or cruel anticipation. The ambiguity itself is the point. Hope can be shelter, something you lean on when nothing else offers security. Or it can be illusion, stretched across generations, keeping you waiting for what will not arrive. Then and now, it can feel like comfort or like bait. What made hope so difficult to classify is its reach. Fire needed wood. Clay hardened only with heat. But hope required nothing outside a human mind. It could exist in an empty cave, in famine, even in the shadow of death. It circulated without smoke, without sparks. One glance from one person to another carried it further. This made it unlike any gift or curse Zeus and the other gods had bestowed before. That difference raises another question. Was Zeus creating a leash or a loophole? If hope was false, then he ensured humans would tie themselves to empty futures. If it was real, then he allowed a resource that loosened Olympus's control. Because as long as one human carried this unseen endurance, calamity could destroy villages, but never spirit. Power rooted in heaven would always meet resistance rooted in thought. Fire expanded survival. Hope expanded meaning. Even if Zeus dismissed it as harmless, the effect in mortal life was unpredictable. It helped people continue small tasks that fed entire generations, planting seeds that might sprout, lifting stones that might build, trying again after loss. It allowed tomorrow to exist in imagination long enough to become tomorrow in reality. At times, this might have turned into wasted persistence. At others, it created new chapters when the story seemed finished. Seen this way, Prometheus gave two gifts, one visible and one hidden. He handed over flame, which mortals used openly. Zeus's plan brought affliction, but in the grinding of that burden, hope remained in reserve. By Hesiod's telling, every human life therefore became a mixture, one part heat to fight darkness, one part pain to shape endurance, and one quiet part still sealed, whispering that not all was over. That makes hope not an answer, but an open door that mortals must decide how to face. Some opened their lives around it, held by courage it supplied. Others felt chained to promises never fulfilled. That unresolved tension remained at the core of humanity's condition. Always uncertain, always straining forward, unsure whether they were guided or deceived. What matters most is that hope never leaves the myth, never burns out, never fully explains itself. Whether comfort or trick, it takes root alongside suffering, as permanent as fire itself. Human lives are never told without it. You can picture flames in caves, tools struck from stone, words around a hearth, and behind all of it, some fragment of belief that there is still another day worth surviving, which leads to a larger view. The Greeks didn't imagine humanity as one continuous rise. They described it as a sequence, a reworking, each generation shaped under different terms. Hope, sealed or waiting, was not about restoring a golden perfection. It was about enduring each new form of life as it came. And for the storytellers, there was not just one humanity, but many, built, broken, and remade. In Hesiod's Works and Days, humanity's story is broken into 5 distinct ages. Instead of one smooth history, he imagined a sequence of experiments, each generation with its own character, each eventually replaced by the next. You stand at the end of that sequence, in the Iron Age, but 4 others came first. Walking through them shows how the Greeks pictured rise, decline, and the lessons each stage carried. The first was the Golden Age. Life required no labor. The earth provided what people needed without planting or toil. Death came softly, more like sleep than loss, and mortals lived without hardship or fear. When they passed, they lingered as gentle spirits watching over the world. This was a picture not of struggle but of effortless abundance, a reminder of what life might look like without need. Then came the Silver Age. Mortals here stretched out their childhoods for far too long, growing slowly, never quite reaching maturity. When at last they became adults, they were arrogant and refused to honor the gods. Their lives ended in punishment. Zeus destroyed them, and unlike the golden people they left behind, no guiding spirits. They were remembered instead as a failure, undone by their lack of respect. After them came the Bronze Age. This generation seemed almost built of the metal itself, unyielding, violent, and devoted to war. They lived hard, built homes of bronze, carried bronze weapons, and used fire mainly for destruction. They had little taste for peace or for growing food. Their constant battle frenzy consumed them until they destroyed themselves, leaving behind no lasting spirit or memory. They were strength without restraint, an age that collapsed under its own rage. The Fourth Age broke the pattern. Hesiod names it the Heroic Age, a pause, not a new direction. He treats it as a special, glorious exception. Here were the warriors remembered in epic tales, Achilles and Odysseus among them. Their violence was real, but it carried meaning, justice, honor, or divine purpose. Unlike the Bronze race, they were not faceless destroyers. Some of them, after death, were even rewarded with life on the Isles of the Blessed, eternal in peace. It was a brief uplift in the sequence, as if human greatness could surface, even if only for a time. Finally came the Iron Age, Hesiod's own world, and ours as well. Humans in this age live by labor. Hunger, injustice, and ceaseless work mark every stage of life. Nothing arrives freely. Crops demand endless effort. Families strain under poverty, and disputes corrode communities. Warfare exists not as sheer rage, but as calculation, often lacking honor. Greed and betrayal seep through households and villages, while even childhood brings hardship. For Hesiod, it was an age of weariness, where justice was rare and struggle perpetual, with no promise of relief. Taken together, the sequence teaches a pattern: abundance given, arrogance punished, strength wasted, nobility glimpsed, and finally, a life defined by toil. Hesiod's vision wasn't of progress, but of decline, each generation further from divine favor, closer to hardship. Similar cycles appear in other traditions, Indian yugas stretching from golden beginnings to dark endings, Roman accounts of fading virtue, even later myths of a lost paradise. For the Greeks, this ordering echoed a wider human sense that time wears down what once was whole. But the lesson wasn't just that history weakens. Each age showed that humans never sat in balance. Golden souls failed through complacency, silver from arrogance, bronze from fury, iron from corruption. Even the heroes, who stood briefly higher, still died for their battles. Each generation revealed a flaw that drove it to collapse. Yet none were final. One followed another, and life, however diminished, went on. That persistence mattered. Hesiod despised his own Iron Age, but he could not deny it still stood. People worked, raised families, honored the gods, and endured. Fragility did not mean disappearance. Every age proved that no matter how much was lost, something carried forward. Hope, left sealed in Pandora's jar, was not about restoring the Golden Age. It was about meeting iron with endurance, plowing fields year after year, surviving even when decay seemed inevitable. So imagine those 5 ages like layers of earth: gold, silver, bronze, heroes, iron, each cracked, each fallen, but none erasing the line of human survival. Every flaw pulled mortals further from ease, but none could end them completely. Each age falls, yet humanity continues. That persistence is the through line. Pause for a breath here to let that slow decline sink in. Because what comes next isn't strength or abundance. It's something else entirely. The quiet cunning that soft clay uses when faced with a sky full of thunder. Outsmarting the Gods was never about strength. Mortals couldn't roar louder than Zeus or fight the sky with stones. The only option was wit. Prometheus set that example from the beginning. He didn't just bring fire, he also gave humans a way to bend divine power with cunning. Hesiod relates this trick as the origin of the sacrificial custom, and though it sounds ordinary, it shaped the boundary between gods and mortals. Picture the scene. Humans prepare their first offering, torn between fear and hunger. If they gave the gods the best cuts of meat, they themselves would starve. If they held back, they risked offending powers that wield lightning. No choice seemed safe. Prometheus took the ox carcass and split it in 2 piles. He concealed the good meat beneath a covering of stomach lining to make it look unappealing. Then he stacked nothing but bare bones, slick with gleaming fat, until they looked rich. He asked Zeus to choose. The choice was made. Zeus picked the shining pile and accepted bones and fat. Mortals kept the true food. From then on, animal sacrifice followed the same pattern: fat and smoke to the gods, flesh for mortals. This trick set a precedent. Mortals could preserve their own sustenance while maintaining ritual deference to the gods. With a brief pause before Zeus's reaction, the story shifts from a clever move to a permanent tradition. Zeus realized he had been deceived. His authority wasn't damaged by losing meat, but by losing control. Sacrifice had turned from surrender into contract. Mortals pretended obedience, with smoke and ceremony rising toward Olympus, even as they quietly kept what they needed to live. That turn of ritual showed him something unsettling, that clay could calculate. Schemes moved faster than weapons, and once ingrained in practice, they spread beyond any one altar. Sacrifice carried 2 layers. On the surface, it honored the gods with ceremony, flames, and scent. Underneath, the true meal belonged to the mortals. It was worship and defiance bound together, a tradition that acted both as tribute and survival tactic. Every offering became a reminder that mortals retained agency, even under divine rule. Seen this way, Prometheus's trick weighed more than any battle. It shifted the relationship itself. Mortals learned to survive by bending rules, not by breaking them outright. The ritual bones and fat did not destroy the bond with Olympus. They kept it, while also pushing its limits. It was the first template for mortal cunning. Accept divine power symbolically, but preserve what sustains you in reality. Later myths repeated this pattern in other forms. Odysseus outwitted monsters. Villagers bargained with misfortune through ritual. Heroes survived because they disguised truth. Trickery and sacrifice set that tradition in motion. Guile was not just one clever act, it became part of what being human meant. Fire gave endurance, but cunning gave autonomy. For Zeus, this revealed a deeper unease. The gods didn't fear human strength, they feared human thought. A race able to transform deception into culture was harder to contain. If clay could trick once, it could trick again, and each small precedent carried forward. That possibility threatened to loosen Olympus's grip, but wit drew consequences. Prometheus's prank with the ox led to Zeus's suspicion. His theft of fire earned an endless torment on a mountain. Humanity's copies of his sacrifice scam meant their offerings always carried suspicion with them. Outsmarting the divine gave breathing room, but it also marked mortals for punishment. That balance reveals the paradox. Humans were fragile, but carried two hidden tools, fire and cunning. Fire warmed bodies and built tools. Cunning carved independence inside ritual itself. Each one was a little freedom in a world that pressed them down. Yet every freedom carried its price. The gods answered each cleverness with sharper punishment, reminding mortals they had not been left unchecked. The story's logic became circular. Trickery brought survival. Punishment followed, but even punishment did not erase the impulse to outwit. Humans played the game again and again because survival demanded it. The bones and fat offering did not vanish after one success. It became tradition because it ensured mortals ate, which meant mortals lived. Zeus could not ignore that fact. Bones and smoke honored him in ritual, but flesh kept mortals going. And so each sacrifice became not just food, but an acknowledgement of tension in the cosmos. Mortals bowed to divine authority in public, yet quietly sustained their own lives in private. The gods could punish, but they could not cancel the need of mortals to preserve themselves. That uneasy pairing lasted as long as Greek ritual itself. Temples, villages, and festivals centered on burning fat for the divine, eating flesh for the human. Both parts mattered. Both parts were remembered. And inside that repeated action, mortals kept their survival, one meal at a time. What it meant in the end was that survival was never passive. Even under Olympian power, humans carved out their own path using cunning. They never fought Zeus on equal terms. They found loopholes. They honored him and deceived him in the same gesture. Outsmarting the gods did not eliminate struggle. It assured it. But it also gave mortals a measure of freedom they otherwise would have lacked. That freedom was fragile, always shadowed by reprisal. But it endured. Each time humanity managed to bend divine rule, Olympus pushed back harder. Trickery led to torment. Survival led to new punishments. And the more mortals relied on cunning, the harsher the trials they would have to face. This cycle, guile, reprisal, adjustment, fed into the larger stories about floods, plagues, and monsters. The gods grew more active in their hostility, determined to test or erase the clay that dared to scheme. And still, mortals kept finding ways to continue, because when the gods tried not just to limit you, but to end you, the game of survival took on new stakes. What happens when the gods decide not just to test humans but to erase them altogether? You have fire for warmth, tools for work, and that faint pulse of hope still sealed inside Pandora's jar. But then the sky darkens, the air grows heavy, and the stories say the Olympians turned their full attention downward. Survival stopped being ordinary hardship. It became life inside a world where floods, plagues, and terrors of the imagination arrived as deliberate blows. The first strike was water. The flood survivors, Deucalion and Pyrrha, are remembered because Zeus, disgusted by mortal arrogance, sent waves to drown nearly everyone else. Mountains vanished beneath the deluge, villages dissolved, and silence replaced the voices of countless lives. Clinging to a wooden chest across endless water, only those two remained. When at last the waters withdrew, they cast stones behind them, which turned into men and women, a new seed for humanity. The world began again from the edge of disappearance. Next came plague, a quieter but equally devastating tool. Stories tell of entire communities undone not by war, but by air itself. Breath grew heavy, bodies weakened, and fields lay empty, not because they lacked crops, but because no one remained strong enough to harvest them. The blow was indiscriminate. Whole households gone, whole generations smothered under a sickness whispered from Olympus. The cause was never clear. Perhaps a missed sacrifice. Perhaps the gods quarreled among themselves and mortals paid the cost. Whatever the reason, the human side of the story was always the same. Many lives lost in silence, no cure within reach. And then came monsters. Some were so vast they seemed to challenge even Zeus, like Typhon, whose many heads spat storms into the world. Others were small and deadly, but impossible to kill, like Hydra with its endless coils. Chimera, snakes, dragons, each one appeared not as a random curiosity, but as another hostility designed to make survival fragile. Try planting a field, knowing a winged beast might flatten it. Try raising walls when you suspect something inhuman waits to tear them down. For mortals, these creatures made daily life into a kind of siege. Even the natural world often turned hostile, as if commanded by temper instead of seasons. Drought pressed close until soil cracked. Storms scattered ships and flooded coastlines. Winters extended longer than they should, leaving clay-built bodies cold and weak. To mortals, weather could never be just weather. Every stretch of hunger, every ruined harvest carried suspicion. Had they angered Zeus, or forgotten a gesture of honor to some smaller god? Or were they simply pawns in quarrels far away, their lives caught in the splash of divine arguments? The same flood motif was not unique to Greece. Mesopotamian epics speak of Utnapishtim, surviving sweeping waters. Later, the Hebrew scriptures told of Noah's Ark. In each case, water was not just destruction, but a kind of reset, pressing humans back down before allowing them to rise again. Myths across cultures used this same design: divine flood, near erasure, thin thread of survival, as though the memory of drowning stood behind many human imaginations at once. And yet, myths consistently show survivors rebuilding, resettling, and renewing the world. Deucalion and Pyrrha repopulated their land after the flood. Farmers planted after sickness receded. Villages rose again in the same places monsters had destroyed. People walked on wreckage, but decided to linger, build, and continue. Each destruction didn't close the story, but led to another opening. This pattern wasn't triumph over the divine. Mortals never defeated plague with weapons. They never strapped lightning against Typhon and won. Survival was the victory, a rhythm made from collapse, followed by renewal. The stories never let humans rest in peace, but they never let them vanish either. Clay cracked again and again, but it reshaped. It's here that the myths carry their quietest message. You did not rise toward perfection. You did not escape hardship or return to some golden age. You survived because survival itself defined humankind. Iron humanity planted where fields had burned. It built houses where storms had leveled the last ones. It told stories on top of stories precisely because forgetting would have been easier. But persistence was more human. The gods erased, but mortals remade. Suffering was weighty, losses uncountable, yet the stories refused to end. Each time the world bent toward ruin, and each time you find in the legends someone who picks up stone, till, or word, and begins again. The Olympians showed power by destruction, but humans revealed theirs through quiet endurance. This resistance was not invisible. Over repeated cycles, endurance itself became its own kind of legend. Farmers replanting after floods, strangers rebuilding a village after plague, shepherds carving out existence under threat of beasts. Each of these simple acts accumulated meaning. They marked humanity not as perfect or secure, but as unwilling to end. Out of this persistence, slowly, individual stories sharpened into myths of people who stood larger than the crowd. And in time, these survivors would not only rebuild. Some would rise into figures remembered as more than mortal. From families huddled against storms, from villages shaken by illness, from the clay that wouldn't yield to extinction came the names the ancients called heroes. What unsettled Olympus most wasn't mortals shouting defiance upward. It was something closer to home, gods leaving parts of themselves in human bloodlines. Demigods turned the boundary between divine and mortal into a blur. Suddenly the gap between thunderbolt and clay narrowed, and figures like Heracles, Perseus, and Theseus took shape. Their stories, told in classical epics and preserved by later mythmakers, stood as proof that humanity could cross into domains the gods tried to seal off. A demigod was not only stronger than an ordinary mortal. They were a reminder that Olympus itself was not untouchable. Their divine parentage made them both adored and feared by Olympus. Heracles remains the best known, his name stretching further than nearly any other. Son of Zeus and a mortal woman, his life was marked from the start by Hera's rage against her husband's infidelity. Curses and madness pressed down on him, yet what emerged was endurance. Instead of vanishing under divine hostility, he endured the 12 labors. Each task, whether overpowering beasts or cleansing filth, wasn't just superhuman spectacle. It symbolized redemption through work, survival carved again and again out of impossible trials. His story reads like labor elevated to cosmic stage, echoing the endless toil of Iron Age mortals who bent their backs to keep living. Perseus's pattern looked different. Born into danger, abandoned to the sea in a chest, he began with nothing. His name is remembered because he faced Medusa, the Gorgon whose eyes froze men in an instant. Victory didn't come with raw strength, but with reflection, the mirrored shield that let him strike without direct sight. It was cunning against lethal force. Perseus showed survival could hinge less on muscle, more on wit carefully applied. That is why his myth survives as a lasting image of cleverness outmaneuvering destruction, the same trait mortals relied on to trick famine, storms, or enemies stronger than themselves. Theseus carried yet a third form of survival. His trial centered not only on slaying the Minotaur, but on escaping the labyrinth itself. Corridors without end, darkness winding until reason collapsed. He overcame not by solitary bravery, but by cooperation. Ariadne's thread gave him the way back. An act of aid and memory turned into salvation. Theseus's victory symbolized survival through community. You don't endure alone. You endure because someone else hands you the thread you cannot spin yourself. If Heracles reflected labor and Perseus reflected craft, Theseus revealed the necessity of shared knowledge in order to survive. Pulled together, the sketches form a clear pattern. Half-gods dramatized human strategies for survival. Heracles proved strength could cleanse and endure. Perseus proved cunning could outwit lethal traps. Theseus proved cooperation could outlast confusion. Their lives may have existed on a mythic scale, but the strategies came from human life below Olympus. Heroes became outsized mirrors of the same resilience iron mortals used when farming thin soil, bargaining with the gods, or warding off hunger. Yet their presence disturbed the hierarchy above. Each hero's triumph doubled as a revelation that divine power had limits. Every monster slain or labor completed was tangible proof humanity contained more than Zeus intended. The gods' response was to keep their victories costly. Heracles descended into madness. Perseus lived under the weight of violent destiny. Theseus's successes ended with betrayal or loss. Each triumph brought punishment or downfall, ensuring no hero completed the story untouched. That tension reveals how closely gods watch their hybrid children. Divine blood allowed survival against impossible odds, but it also carried penalties, curses, and constant suspicion. Heroes weren't immortal, they bled and died. They were strong enough to humiliate monsters, yet vulnerable enough to be broken by fits of rage or twists of fate. Living between mortal pain and divine hostility, they showed both gift and cost. In them, mortals saw their own lives reflected with amplification. Toil harder, bleed deeper, suffer louder, triumph brighter. Their stories also explained practices and traditions. Myth often worked as charter. Theseus tied Athens to civic order, embodying its structure. Heracles became ritual shorthand for cleansing and endurance, embedded in ceremonies. The hero wasn't just legend, but a way societies traced their own roots. Ordinary mortals took meaning not because they matched a hero's feats, but because their fields, shrines, and city walls were said to rise from the same struggle. Heroes turned endurance into civic identity. At the same time, the gods' suspicion grew. Zeus himself lived haunted by prophecy. He had overthrown Cronus only because Cronus feared being deposed. The cycle haunted every new generation. If mortals mixed with gods and kept growing stronger, what guarantee did Zeus have that his reign would last? Every demigod victory made that fear sharper. Olympus admired heroes in songs and festivals, but behind the praise, distrust lingered like smoke. This is why heroes burned brightly but briefly. The myths exalted their names and swiftly cut them down. To admire them was to recognize mortal potential. To see their downfalls was to remember boundaries. Hubris did not go unpunished, even when the offense was excellence itself. Heroes taught that mortals could resist famine, monsters, or storm, but they also warned that going too far toward the divine invited destruction. Admiration was always laced with caution. So the half-divine weren't celebrated because they escaped mortal struggle. They were celebrated because they embodied it in louder tones. They endured crushing tasks, faced cruel punishments, and relied on cunning or community to emerge, however briefly, triumphant. In their deaths or downfalls, mortals saw reminders that even greatness carried fragility. In their feats, mortals saw confirmation that clay could endure more than Olympus imagined. And yet the larger story still held. The true endurance did not lie in one man, however legendary. It lay in the millions of unnamed who continued after the songs ended. Heracles, Perseus, Theseus may have stood out, but ordinary people lived the quieter version of the same story, working fields, nursing families through plagues, rebuilding after storms. Heroes instructed mortals in what was possible, but communities lived that lesson daily. Yet the story's true hero remains the human community who, like these figures, keep moving forward without divine guarantees. Their tenacity unsettled the gods more deeply than weapons or curses ever could. Which brings us to a sharper question. Why would Zeus, holding lightning in his fist and ruling Olympus without challenge, feel anxiety at all over mortals? Zeus's deepest unease was not about bolts of lightning or the threat of another titan rising from the deep. What he feared most was far quieter, the persistence of the mortals below. Hesiod and other poets treat divine anxiety over succession and rebellion as an underlying theme, and Zeus carried this forward into his rule. He had seen what happens when powers fall. He knew too well that thrones were not eternal, even for gods. The memory of his own family's pattern never left him. Uranus cast aside by Cronus. Cronus toppled by Zeus. Each generation turning against the one before, each clinging to power through suspicion and fear. Cronus even swallowed his children, desperate to prevent replacement. Zeus escaped that fate, but the story etched into him a lesson. Rule was never secure, and the one who assumes immortality of power forgets how fragile it truly is. With that memory heavy in his mind, every step humans took toward progress looked less like survival and more like rehearsal for rebellion. When mortals fed fire at their hearths, he saw the shape of lightning stolen in miniature. When they beat bronze into tools and weapons, he saw a shadow of Hephaestus's forge in mortal hands. Sacrifices twisted into clever bargains, rather than pure offerings, fat and bone for Olympus, rich meat for the people, were echoes of Hermes, sly and double-faced. These were God's abilities mirrored in clay, and as those mirrors multiplied, the line between divine and human began to look less certain. What Zeus feared most was not arrogance shouted at Olympus, but the blurred reflection of himself staring back from the human race. Hubris became the word to frame this. The Greeks defined it as arrogance overstepping the human sphere, a dangerous climb into territories reserved for gods. Stories of hubris punished, whether Icarus tumbling from the sky or Niobe turned to stone, were more than entertainment. They were warnings written into memory. Mortals should not mimic divine powers too closely. A society that keeps repeating these lessons is a society guarding fragile boundaries. Zeus was not merely insulted by boldness. He was policing the edges that kept Olympus elevated. Each time humans overreached, he struck them down, hoping to prevent erosion of the difference that kept divine rule secure. The pattern shows clearly once you trace it. Prometheus steals fire, so Zeus imposes Pandora and her jar of afflictions. Men trick with sacrifices, so he clamps down with punishments. Humanity persists and builds, so floods sweep them away, leaving only Deucalion and Pyrrha to begin again. Every advance faced its counterweight. Mortals could never climb without chains rattling at their ankles. This wasn't spite alone. It was regulation, designed to slow the pace of human innovation. Progress had to carry suffering beside it, or else Zeus would see it as an unbearable threat. Still, no punishment erased the drive forward. Floods washed lives away, but the survivors cast stones to repopulate. Plagues emptied fields, yet new families grew to fill them. Monsters prowled, heroes rose to strike them down. The fragile shell of mortality cracked again and again, but it reshaped itself each time. That persistence is what gnawed at Zeus more than mortality itself. He did not need to remind humans they would die. The body already spoke that truth. But he noticed that even when death claimed individuals, the community lived on. Mortals didn't vanish. They renewed. That renewal mirrored the same cycle Zeus himself had lived. Overthrow, survival, return, and rule again. He had risen from crisis and claimed authority, but watching mortals do the same threatened the uniqueness of his claim. If clay could endure setbacks and continue without divine permission, then a crucial thread of control slipped from Olympus's grip. Immortals clung to permanence, but mortals clung to momentum, and momentum looked too much like prophecy fulfilled. Hesiod's audience would have caught this implication. Tales of hubris were at once cautionary tales and veiled admissions of divine insecurity. If gods really stood so far above, why retell story after story of humans punished for climbing too close? The thrones on Olympus were not as solid as the marble suggested. Zeus raged because he saw resemblances in every spark lit on earth. Fire no longer belonged only to the sky, and with it rose the thought, what might come next? That question turned into a cycle of overreach and reprisal. Fire drew punishment, but punishment bred new endurance. Famine reined mortals in, but hunger sharpened invention until new tools broke through again. Floods erased villages, but survivors rebuilt stone by stone. Zeus could not unmake the human instinct to continue, and that continuity itself was the danger, because one day persistence accumulates into presence too visible to ignore. Zeus feared continuity more than confrontation. Another Titan war might be fought and won with thunderbolts, but mortal endurance worked differently. It didn't gather in armies. It gathered in generations. Children followed parents. Fields were sown again and again. Stories repeated so memory never died. This collective rhythm created a different sort of immortality, one Zeus could not destroy by killing a single body. Mortals built their permanence by refusing to end, no matter how much was lost. To the gods, continuity itself looked like a creeping rebellion. Even the myths reveal this through what they leave unsaid. Rarely do they dwell on the fragility of life. Everyone knew sickness, hunger, and aging without needing a god to remind them. Instead, the focus lands on moments when mortals act a little too much like deities. Steal fire, survive deluges, outwit monsters. Those are the moments Zeus punished hardest, because they spoke of refusal. They spoke of mortals not satisfied with the role of fragile clay. And in those moments, the echo of succession haunted him most loudly, as if each act of renewal was a rehearsal for toppling. To modern ears, this anxiety might sound familiar. Powerful rulers in every age fear not individual rivals, but the slow collective weight of the many. A lone rebellion can be crushed, but the daily persistence of countless lives, working, building, enduring, accumulates in ways harder to contain. That's the closest comparison one can make to Zeus's dread. Not fear of a single hero, but of the pattern stretching onward, mortals refusing final defeat. And that leaves us with the irony at the center of the tale. The gods were immortal in body, safe from death. Mortals were immortal only in continuity, refusing to vanish across time. Zeus could chain Prometheus, drown armies, or send monsters into villages, yet none of it ended the line of human survival. What he feared most was not rebellion with weapons, but persistence with memory. Mortals stacking generation upon generation until no catastrophe erased them for long. Even in myths, heavy with disaster, humanity always started again. And each time it did, Zeus's control looked a little thinner, his throne a little less permanent. Continuity became resistance. Fire, cunning, and hope were tools, but endurance was the weapon he could never pry away. If that was what Zeus feared most, what did it mean for the people who had nothing but clay for skin and breath for life? Could that fear itself point to the real gift that outlasted every punishment? We'll return to that thought soon. What if the true gift wasn't the spark smuggled in a fennel stalk, but something quieter, rooted inside you from the beginning? A flame might cook one meal, last one winter, or forge one tool, but left on its own, it burns down to ash. Wood runs out, spears splinter, cities crumble. What endures isn't the torch. It's the instinct that keeps you standing when the torch fails. The real gift was not fire itself, but resilience. In Hesiod's telling, two forces shaped that legacy at once. Prometheus gave fire. Pandora brought suffering, and hope, sealed ambiguously in the jar. Taken together, the myths say mortals carried both tools and burdens, both affliction and endurance. Fire could be stolen, suffering imposed, but hope lived in shadow, neither gone nor fully given, a reminder that survival was never simple possession. Prometheus crouched low, hiding flame for mortals, but the stories always pulled attention back to what followed. The theft alone did not define humanity. It was the punishments, the floods, the plagues, the monsters, and above all the continuities that mattered. Each calamity pressed mortals to the ground, yet each time they rose again. Fire may have helped them cook and forge, but it was the will to survive, the quiet skill of continuing, that most defined their story. Pause. Slow here. That was Prometheus's deeper gift, showing that survival itself was possible even when the gods tried to strip it away. Fire, by its nature, lasts only as long as something feeds it. Anyone who has watched embers collapse into black ash knows how temporary it is. Metals rust, walls decay, fields wither. But hope proved more stubborn. It needed no wood, no shrine, no God's permission. It seated itself inside the human mind and circulated person to person. The more hardship pressed, the sharper it became. The harsher the punishment, the more enduring the whisper to try again anyway. Hesiod left hope sealed in the jar, ambiguous and incomplete. And that placement was the irony. Zeus thought he had bound it, either kept it back as withheld mercy, or locked it inside as bait. But the myth itself preserved it. You don't forget a jar with one thing still trapped inside. Hope became permanent memory. One way to read the cycle is that hope, locked or freed, became humanity's lasting weapon, a shadow that survived every divine strike. You can watch this echoed straight through the old stories. The flood survivors Deucalion and Pyrrha step out of their chest onto empty land. They throw stones behind them, and out of that ordinary gesture people return. That's hope as action, transforming desolation into continuity stone by stone. And the same pattern repeats every time communities reappear after ruin. Myth doesn't skip these refoundings. It highlights them, as if to insist resilience is the central motif. This helps you see why Zeus hated it. Fire you can stamp out, but hope clings to dust and bones. Punish one city, another lights its hearth again. Strike down a father, children carry on. Flood swept the world once, yet people rebuilt the fields and houses anyway. For Zeus, punishment kept mortals in place only temporarily. The inner spark, the instinct to continue, found ways to grow back each time. It's not hard to see why that unnerved him. If mortals could be erased once and yet return, what did that say about the permanence of divine authority? Each cycle made the clay look more durable than Olympus intended. Fire flashed like rebellion. Resilience settled like prophecy. The deeper point is that the myths themselves model this persistence. Heracles chained to his labors, Theseus finding the thread in the dark, Perseus outwitting Medusa's gaze. Hero stories are the loud echoes of the same instinct you find in the villagers who kept replanting after floods. Even in quieter tales, people survive exile, endure plagues, rebuild their shrines. Myth works not by pretending fragility disappears, but by tying endurance directly to identity. Modern thinkers, too, notice how survival often hangs on that frame of mind. Studies of disasters show communities recover because they believe recovery is possible. That's the same quality Hesiod left as a question in the jar. Call it dangerous illusion or blessed endurance, but it still decides who crumbles and who continues. Think back to Prometheus himself. His body tore daily under the eagle, but he did not renounce the stolen fire. His punishment became the model. Survival sometimes means not stopping, even when no relief arrives. That stance, the the steady refusal to recant even when pain never ends, is the clearest mirror of human persistence. For mortals, that lesson deepened into a kind of inheritance. Fire hardened clay into brick. Hope hardened clay into will. Every city rebuilt after destruction. Every field sown again after famine. Every story retold after disaster became continuity in practice. None of it erased grief, but each act restored tomorrow as a possibility. That is what still resonates in Hesiod's bleak Iron Age. Not glory, not victory, but survival itself as defiance. The puzzle of the jar's ending remains unsolved. Was hope meant as mercy, slipping out in traces to help people endure? Or was it meant as cruelty, withheld to sharpen suffering? Either way, humanity lived with it, carried it, rebuilt under its influence. That ongoing fact spoke louder than the gods' motives. Read together. The myths suggest two legacies. Prometheus handed mortals fire. Pandora delivered affliction and left hope unsettled. Out of those twin moments, mortals learned to live by stubborn continuity, to endure scars, hold breath, and plant stone after stone. This double legacy blurred punishment and gift until they became indistinguishable. Survival emerged out of both. So the real gift was never a torch carried down from Olympus. It was the capacity to survive when the torch failed. It was an instinct older than cities, stronger than punishment, sharper than fire itself. Even fragile clay, given breath, proved it could flex across generations until fragility itself became permanence. And that brings the story close to its edge. Because once you see survival as inheritance, you begin to notice what these myths were always pointing toward. That humanity's greatest story was never conquest at all. It was endurance, and what that endurance means, we consider next. Humanity's story was never about conquering others. It was about surviving itself. Every punishment, every flood, every plague, humans rose again, not because they were strong, but because they refused to vanish. That's the real hero's journey, holding on when everything else is cracked. Carry that same quiet spark into your own small routines tonight. Hope doesn't shout. It stays soft, reminding you that tomorrow may still be worth trying for. If this quiet telling gave you a little comfort tonight, consider subscribing, so more gentle stories can find you when you need them. Sleep now, with that small spark kept warm.